Sometimes the most profound moments arrive when we least expect them. Christmas night should have been peaceful for ranch owner Thomas Bennett, but instead he finds himself face to face with a mystery that will change everything he thought he knew about compassion. On his remote Colorado ranch, Thomas discovers a young girl of mixed heritage, attempting to break into his property during a fierce blizzard. His first instinct is to fetch the sheriff, but something about her desperate eyes stops him cold. What she tells him next shatters every assumption he's made about her presence on his land. But what secret could this child possibly be hiding that would shock a man who thought he'd seen everything the frontier had to offer? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 hours when Thomas Bennett first noticed the small boot prints leading from the main trail toward his ranch house. At 48, Thomas had weathered enough Colorado Territory winters to know that fresh snow this deep in December could trap a person for days. But the sight of those tiny impressions in the white blanket covering his front pasture made him pause at his kitchen window. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, Thomas studied the tracks with the practiced eye of a man who had spent the better part of 5 years learning every inch of the Circle B ranch. The prints were small, maybe a child's size, and they wandered in an uncertain line toward the barn before veering toward the main house. Someone had been walking his property in the middle of a Christmas Eve blizzard, and that someone appeared to be quite young. Thomas set his cup on the wooden table and reached for the heavy wool coat hanging by the back door. The house felt too quiet tonight, as it did every Christmas Eve since Sarah and Emma had been taken by the cholera epidemic. 5 years, and the silence still pressed against him like a physical weight. The large stone fireplace crackled with the pine logs he'd split that morning, casting dancing shadows across the handcrafted furniture and rough-hewn beams of the main room. But the warmth never seemed to reach the cold spot that had settled in his chest. This ranch had been his refuge after the sickness, a place to rebuild something resembling a life after losing everything that mattered. He'd sold his shares in the Denver Mining Consortium, left the mansion in Colorado Springs, where every room held memories of his girls, and bought this 8,000-acre spread in the high country. The transition from mining executive to cattle rancher hadn't been easy, but the physical work and endless demands of ranch life had given him something to focus on, besides the crushing weight of grief. The ranch house itself reflected both his past success and his current need for simplicity. Built from local stone and timber with a wide covered porch, it commanded a view of rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines and the occasional stand of aspen. Inside, the furnishings were comfortable but practical, chosen more for durability than elegance. The walls held few personal items, though one particular daguerreotype on the mantelpiece drew his attention every time he passed. The family portrait had been taken just 6 months before the epidemic struck. Sarah's auburn hair was pulled back in the fashion of the day, her green eyes bright with the kind of happiness that seemed effortless then. 10-year-old Emma sat between them, gap-toothed grin splitting her freckled face as she leaned against her mother. Thomas remembered how Emma had insisted on wearing her favorite blue dress, despite his suggestion that they choose something more formal for the sitting. Sarah had whispered to him over their daughter's head, "Let her be herself, Tom. That's what makes her beautiful." Now, as he prepared to venture into the storm to investigate the mysterious footprints, Thomas found himself glancing at that daguerreotype. Sarah would have insisted on bringing whoever was out there inside immediately, no questions asked. She'd always seen the good in people first, the potential for kindness even in strangers. Emma would have been right beside her, probably already, putting together a care package of warm milk and molasses cookies, but Thomas had learned to be more cautious. The frontier had taught him that tragedy could strike without warning, that safety was often an illusion. Still, those small boot prints in the snow stirred something in him that he'd tried to keep buried. Maybe it was the approaching anniversary of their deaths, or maybe it was the particular loneliness of Christmas Eve, but he found himself thinking about what Sarah would do instead of what made the most sense. He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the covered porch. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and the distant smell of wood smoke from the bunkhouse where his ranch hands were spending Christmas Eve. Thomas had installed oil lamps along the main paths around the property after moving in, more out of practical necessity than fear, and now their amber glow created pools of yellow light across the yard. The boot prints were even more pronounced up close. Definitely a child's size, maybe a girl's from the narrow shape. They wandered somewhat aimlessly, as if the person making them had been uncertain of their destination. Thomas followed the trail across the yard, noting how the prints seemed to circle the house once before approaching the front porch. Someone had been studying his home, learning its layout. His ranch foreman, Miguel Hernandez, lived in the bunkhouse with the other hands, but maintained his own small cabin about a quarter-mile down the valley with his wife Rosa, who served as Thomas's housekeeper and occasional cook. Miguel had worked cattle ranches most of his life and possessed the kind of instinctive understanding of land and animals that couldn't be taught. At 42, he was only a few years younger than Thomas, but carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Rosa, meanwhile, had quickly appointed herself as Thomas's unofficial guardian, ensuring he ate regular meals and didn't spend all his time brooding alone in the big house. Both Miguel and Rosa had urged him to reconnect with the small community of ranchers and townspeople in nearby Cedar Falls, to attend church services or join the local stockmen's association. But Thomas preferred the solitude of ranch work. He'd grown comfortable with the rhythms of feeding cattle, mending fences, and breaking horses. These tasks required attention but not emotional investment, and they filled the hours between sunrise and sunset with purpose, if not joy. Tonight, though, as he followed those small prints through the snow, Thomas felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that someone else was struggling through a difficult night. The prince led him around the corner of the house toward the kitchen garden that Rosa had insisted on planting the previous spring. The area was protected from the worst of the wind by a wooden fence, and the footprints seemed to linger here, as if their maker had taken shelter for a while. That's when Thomas saw her. A small figure crouched behind the tool shed, barely visible in the shadows, despite the lamplight. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, with dark skin that suggested mixed heritage and hair that caught the snow like tiny stars. She was dressed in clothes too thin for the weather. A worn woolen dress, thin shawl, and boots that had seen better days. She was trying to work something loose from the shed's window frame, her small hands struggling with what appeared to be a loose board. For a moment, Thomas simply watched. The girl worked with the desperate quiet of someone who believed she was unobserved, glancing frequently toward the house as she tried to create an opening large enough to crawl through. She wasn't attempting to break into the main house, he realized, just trying to find shelter from the storm. Something about her careful movements, the way she tried not to leave obvious signs of her presence, suggested this wasn't malicious mischief, but simple survival. Thomas cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her into running. "It's pretty cold out here for evening chores," he said, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. The girl spun around, her eyes wide with terror. In the amber glow of the oil lamp, Thomas could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe 10 or 11, with large dark eyes and features that spoke of both Mexican and Negro heritage. Her clothes were worn but clean, suggesting she came from people who took pride in appearances despite limited means. Snow clung to her thin shawl, and she was shivering violently. "Please don't fetch the sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't stealing nothing. I swear, I just needed somewhere warm for tonight." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the careful armor he'd built around his heart. This wasn't a hardened criminal or a troublemaker. This was a child, alone and cold on Christmas Eve, desperate enough to risk breaking into a stranger's property just to get out of the storm. "What's your name?" he asked, taking a careful step closer. The girl backed against the shed, her whole body tense with the urge to flee. "Keisha," she said finally, "and I know this is your land, mister, but I didn't have anywhere else to go." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, seeing something of Emma in her defiant chin and frightened eyes. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him that kindness was a choice, not a luxury. The frontier could be harsh, but it didn't have to make him harsh as well. "Well, Keisha," he said, quietly, "it's too cold for either of us to be having this conversation out here. How about we go inside where there's a warm fire, and you can tell me why you're spending Christmas Eve trying to break into my tool shed, instead of being safe at home with your family?" The girl's expression flickered between hope and wariness. "You ain't gonna turn me over to the law. I'm thinking we should get you warm first, then figure out what needs figuring." Thomas gestured toward the house. "Besides, it's Christmas Eve. Even the sheriff's probably home with his family tonight." As they walked through the snow toward the warm glow of the ranch house windows, Thomas found himself wondering what circumstance could drive a child of mixed blood to risk freezing on a Colorado mountainside rather than seek help through proper channels. In a territory where tensions between different groups ran high, where a child like Keisha might face suspicion or worse from many white families, he began to understand why she'd chosen stealth over direct appeal for help. Whatever her story, Thomas realized that this Christmas Eve was about to become very different from the quiet, grief-filled evening he'd planned. And for the first time in 5 years, he found himself grateful for the interruption. Keisha hesitated at the threshold of Thomas's kitchen, her wet boots squeaking against the pine floorboards. The warmth of the house seemed to overwhelm her, and she stood awkwardly by the door, dripping snow onto the braided rug, while her teeth continued to chatter. Thomas noticed how her eyes darted around the room, taking in the iron cook stove, the polished wooden counters, and the comfortable sitting area near the large stone fireplace. This was clearly wealth beyond anything she'd experienced. "Sit here by the fire," Thomas said, gesturing toward the main room. "I'll heat some milk and find you something dry to wear." But Keisha remained frozen in place, clutching a small, worn leather satchel against her chest. "I can't stay," she said, though her voice betrayed how much she wanted to sink into the warmth he offered. "My mama always said I shouldn't take things from white folks who might want something back." The words stung, not because they weren't often true, but because Thomas recognized the hard-earned wisdom behind them. This child had learned to be suspicious of kindness, which meant she'd probably encountered its absence too often. "Your mama sounds like a smart woman," he said carefully. "But sometimes accepting help isn't taking something. Sometimes it's just letting someone be decent." Keisha studied his face with the intense scrutiny of someone much older than her years. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she finally moved toward the fireplace, though she kept her satchel pressed tightly against her body. As she settled into the leather chair closest to the flames, Thomas got his first clear look at her in the bright interior lighting. She was perhaps 11 years old, small for her age, with coffee-colored skin and hair that had been carefully braided despite her current circumstances. Her dress was patched but clean, and her boots, though worn, had been recently oiled. Most telling, though, was the way she held herself, alert, ready to run, but trying to appear smaller than she was. Thomas disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a tin cup of warm milk sweetened with honey. Rosa always kept a supply of preserved goods, and he was grateful now for her foresight. As he handed Keisha the cup, her fingers brushed his, and he was shocked by how cold they were. "When's the last time you ate something?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Keisha wrapped both hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "This morning," she said quietly. "Maybe yesterday morning. Time gets funny when you're walking a lot." "Where have you been walking from?" She took a careful sip of the milk, her eyes never leaving his face. "Denver," she said. "Took me near 2 weeks to get here. Had to hide from soldiers twice and sleep in an old mine shaft once." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Denver was over. 100 miles away, through dangerous mountain terrain. That's a long way for someone your age. What made you come all this way? Keisha set down the cup and reached into her satchel with trembling fingers. She pulled out a folded piece of newsprint, so worn from handling that the edges were soft as cloth. Thomas accepted it carefully, noting how she watched his face as he read. The clipping was from the Rocky Mountain News, dated about 6 months ago. The headline read, "Former mining executive builds successful ranch in high country," and below it was an engraving of Thomas standing beside a prize bull at the territorial fair. The article described his transition from mining fortune to cattle, ranching, mentioning his successful breeding program and his reputation for fair dealing with neighboring ranchers. But what caught Thomas's attention was the handwriting in the margins. Someone had written notes in pencil, mostly directions and landmarks, but also personal observations. "Looks kind in picture, and lost family too, might understand." "Where did you get this?" Thomas asked, his voice gentler than before. Keisha reached back into her satchel and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its cover decorated with pressed flowers and the name Maya written in careful script. "This was my sister's," she said. "She collected newspaper stories about people who seemed good, people who might help if we ever got in real trouble. She said you could tell by looking at someone's eyes whether they were mean or not." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Where is your sister now?" Keisha's composure cracked for the first time since he'd found her. Her lower lip trembled, and she had to take several deep breaths before she could speak. "Maya died 3 months ago. Consumption," the doctor said. "But really it was because we didn't have money for proper medicine and waited too long to take her to see anyone. She was 16. The words hung in the warm air between them like a physical weight. Thomas thought of Emma, of all the times he'd summoned doctors for every fever and cough, never questioning whether they could afford the best care. The casual privilege of that assumption felt suddenly obscene. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "That must have been devastating." Keisha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What family? It was just me and Maya after our grandmother died 2 years ago. The church folks tried to split us up then, but Maya was smart. She convinced them she was old enough to take care of me. We've been on our own since." Thomas set the newspaper clipping on the small table between them, his mind racing. "And your parents?" "Never knew my daddy. Maya said he was a cowboy who moved on before I was born. Mama died when I was 6 from fever. Grandmama took us in, but when she got sick, there wasn't money for her medicines and food for us, too." Keisha's voice took on the flat, matter-of-fact tone that children use when describing unbearable things. "Maya worked at the hotel laundry during the day and cleaned saloons at night. She was really smart, could read and write better than most folks, but there wasn't time for school because of me." The full weight of what this child had endured began to settle over Thomas, like a heavy blanket. Here was a girl who had lost everyone she loved, who had been carrying grief and responsibility that would challenge most adults, and who had walked over 100 miles through dangerous territory based on nothing more than her dead sister's intuition about a stranger's character. "So why did you come here?" he asked. "Why not stay in Denver where you knew your way around?" Keisha pulled the journal closer to her chest, holding it like a shield. "After Maya died, I tried to make it work. Got a job sweeping floors at a mercantile, slept in the back room of a boarding house with some other folks. But last week the church ladies came to take me to an orphanage." She met his eyes directly. "The place they wanted to send me. I heard things about it, bad things, so I ran." Thomas felt anger building in his chest, not at this child, but at a world that had failed her so completely. "You've been on the road for a week?" 9 days. I remembered Maya's journal and all the stories she collected about good people. Yours was the only one close enough to reach on foot. She gestured toward the newspaper clipping. Maya said you looked sad but kind, and that maybe someone who had lost people too would understand what it was like. The observation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His wife's death, Emma's loss, his own grief, none of it was visible in that business engraving, or so he'd thought. But somehow a 16-year-old girl with her own overwhelming burdens had seen through his carefully maintained facade to the broken man underneath. "What exactly do you want from me?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Keisha straightened in the chair, summoning dignity from somewhere deep inside. "I don't want charity," she said firmly. "I can work. I'm good at cleaning and cooking, and I learn fast. Maya always said I was smart like her. I just need somewhere safe to stay, until I can take care of myself. Somewhere the church folks won't think to look. I won't be any trouble, I promise. You won't even know I'm here." Thomas looked at this small, fierce child who had traveled over 100 miles through dangerous territory based on nothing more than hope, and felt something shift permanently in his carefully ordered world. The comfortable routine of solitary grief, the predictable rhythm of ranch work and quiet evenings, the safe isolation he'd built around himself, all of it was about to change, and he found himself both terrified and oddly grateful for the disruption. "That a thing is," Thomas said slowly, "a young girl of mixed blood traveling alone in this territory. That's dangerous beyond anything you might understand. There are men out here who wouldn't hesitate to hurt someone like you, and there are towns where you wouldn't be welcome at all." Keisha nodded soberly. "Maya taught me about that. She said our kind of people always had to be extra careful, especially around white folks we didn't know. But she also said sometimes you have to take risks when the safe choices are worse than the dangerous ones. And staying in Denver was worse than this. The orphanage wasn't just for taking care of kids," Keisha said quietly. Maya heard that. "Some of the girls who went there ended up working in places, doing things that decent people don't talk about. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd run rather than end up somewhere like that." Thomas felt his chest constrict as he understood what she was implying. In a time when a child of mixed race had few protections and fewer advocates, the dangers she'd fled were all too real. The frontier might be harsh, but it wasn't necessarily worse than the predators who operated under the guise of Christian charity. Looking at Keisha, at her quiet courage, her determined dignity, her willingness to risk everything rather than accept a fate that terrified her, Thomas found himself thinking about Emma, about the kind of woman she might have grown up to be if she'd lived. Strong, probably, brave, the kind of person who would stand up for others who couldn't protect themselves. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we'd better figure out how to keep you safe then. But first, let's get you fed properly and find you some warm clothes. Rosa keeps some of her niece's things here. They might fit you well enough." Keisha's relief was visible, but it was quickly followed by wariness. "You mean I can stay? Really?" "We'll take it one day at a time," Thomas said. "But yes, you can stay, at least until we figure out something better." As he watched tears of gratitude well up in her eyes, Thomas realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. He was sheltering a runaway child of mixed race in a territory where such actions could bring unwanted attention from law enforcement, church, authorities, or worse. But as he looked at this brave, damaged girl who reminded him so much of his own lost daughter, he found that he didn't care about the complications. Some things, Sarah would have said, were more important than staying safe. Thomas woke before dawn on Christmas morning to find Keisha already gone from the spare bedroom where he'd settled her the night before. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had she run during the night? But then he heard sounds from the kitchen and caught the scent of coffee brewing and bacon frying. He found her standing at the iron cook stove, carefully tending a pan of eggs, while Bacon sizzled in the cast-iron skillet. "You don't have to do that," he said, noting how she'd had to drag a wooden crate over to reach the stovetop comfortably. Keisha glanced over her shoulder, her expression serious. "Maya always said you earn your keep wherever you are. I found eggs from your chickens and bacon in the smokehouse, and I know how to cook. Figured it was the least I could do." The sight of someone else moving around his kitchen, preparing a meal in the space that had been his solitary domain, unsettled Thomas more than he wanted to admit, but there was something deeply touching about this child's determination to contribute, to prove her worth through action rather than words. The eggs were perfectly set, the bacon crisp but not burnt. She'd even found the butter and preserves, arranging everything on the tin plates, with a care that suggested this ritual meant something important to her. "This is very good," Thomas said as they sat at the wooden table. "Your sister taught you." "Well, Maya said cooking was survival," Keisha replied, cutting her eggs into precise small bites. "If you can make something good from whatever you have, you'll never starve." She paused. "She also said it was a way to show gratitude without using words." They ate in comfortable silence, watching the morning light reveal a world transformed by snow. The familiar landscape of the ranch looked different under its white blanket, softer somehow, as if the harsh edges had been smoothed away. Thomas found himself seeing it through Keisha's eyes, the vast open spaces that must seem like luxury after months of city crowding and dangerous streets. After breakfast, Thomas walked to the bunkhouse to speak with Miguel, explaining only that he had an unexpected guest staying at the main house. Miguel's weathered face showed curiosity, but he didn't press for details. Cowboys learned early not to ask too many questions about each other's business. Rosa was harder to deflect when she arrived to prepare Christmas dinner. She took one look at the extra plate on the table and the small boots by the door, and fixed Thomas with a knowing stare. "Where did she come from?" Rosa asked, her directness cutting through any pretense of casual conversation. At 40, the ranch housekeeper had raised 6 children of her own and possessed an instinctive understanding of when a child was in trouble. "That little girl, she's been through something hard. I can see it in her eyes." Thomas had spent the sleepless hours after midnight preparing for this conversation, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself uncertain how much to reveal. "Her name is Keisha. She's had some family troubles, needed a safe place to stay for a while." Rosa moved closer, lowering her voice. "She's of mixed blood," she observed matter-of-factly. "Mexican and Negro, if I had to guess. That's a hard combination in these parts, especially for a girl child traveling alone." She paused. "How did she end up here?" "She walked from Denver. Her sister died, and she was trying to avoid being placed in an orphanage." Miguel whistled low under his breath from where he'd been listening in the doorway. "Denver. That's better than 100 miles through mountain passes in winter." He shook his head. "That takes more courage than most grown men possess." "Or more desperation," Rosa said grimly. "What kind of orphanage scares a child badly enough to risk freezing to death rather than accept their help?" The question hung in the air, and Thomas found himself reluctant to share Keisha's suspicions about the institution's true purposes. Some things were too dark to speak aloud, especially on Christmas morning. "The kind that doesn't have the child's best interests at heart," Thomas said finally. Rosa crossed herself instinctively. "Pobrecita. No wonder she looks like a frightened rabbit." She paused, studying Thomas's face. "But there's more, isn't there? You wouldn't be this worried if it was just a child needing temporary shelter." Thomas moved to the window, watching Keisha in the yard, where she was attempting to make friends with his cattle dog, Buck. The border collie had been wary of strangers since Thomas found him half-starved on the range 2 years ago. But something about Keisha's patient approach seemed to be working. She sat motionless in the snow, letting Buck approach at his own pace, occasionally extending her hand for him to sniff. "The territorial authorities might come looking for her," Thomas admitted. "Runaway children are usually returned to their guardians, no questions asked, and if they find her here, Miguel asked. "They'll take her back to Denver, and I'll probably face questions about why I didn't turn her over to the sheriff immediately." Rosa shook her head firmly. "That child didn't walk 100 miles in winter just to be dragged back to whatever she was running from. There must be something we can do." "Like what?" Thomas asked. "Hide her indefinitely? Eventually someone will notice, and in a territory where tensions run high between different groups, a white rancher harboring a child of mixed blood could draw the wrong kind of attention." The reality of their situation was stark. The Colorado Territory in 1881 was still finding its footing. Between territorial law and frontier justice, a child like Keisha had few legal protections, and Thomas's wealth and standing in the community could only shield her so much if the wrong people took interest in the situation. "What does the child want?" Miguel asked. "Does she understand the risks?" "She wants to stay until she's old enough to take care of herself," Thomas replied. "She's smart, mature beyond her years, but she's still just 11 years old." Rosa moved to stand beside him at the window, watching Keisha's gentle interaction with Buck. "She has good instincts with animals. That dog hasn't trusted anyone since you brought him home, but look at him now." Indeed, Buck was now allowing Keisha to scratch behind his ears, his tail wagging tentatively. The sight stirred something in Thomas that he'd tried to keep buried, a recognition that healing sometimes happened in unexpected ways, through unexpected connections. "The question," Miguel said quietly, "is what you're prepared to risk for. Because if you're serious about this, it's not just about providing temporary shelter anymore. You'd be taking responsibility for her future, her safety, her chances at a decent life." Thomas thought about the daguerreotype on his mantelpiece, about Emma's bright smile and Sarah's gentle nature. What would they want him to do? Sarah had always believed that people came into your life for a reason, that sometimes helping others was how you found your way back to being whole yourself. "She reminds me of Emma," Thomas said quietly. "Not in looks, but in spirit. That same determination to keep going, even when things seem impossible." "Emma would want you to help her," Rosa said without hesitation. "Your little girl had a good heart just like her mama. She wouldn't want another child to suffer if there was something you could do about it." Thomas watched Keisha throw a stick for Buck, laughing as the dog bounded through the snow to retrieve it. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and the sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking. For just a moment, she looked like the child she should have been allowed to remain, unburdened by loss and responsibility and fear. "What would we tell people?" Thomas asked. "Neighbors, people in town who might ask questions." "We tell them she's Rosa's niece," Miguel suggested, "visiting from New Mexico. That would explain her heritage and her presence here without raising too many questions." Rosa nodded approvingly. "My sister's family lives in Santa Fe. It would be believable that I might take in one of their children if they were having hard times. And if someone checks the story, by the time anyone cared enough to send letters that far south, the child would be older, the situation more settled," Miguel said pragmatically. "Frontier communities don't ask too many questions about people's past as long as they're not causing trouble in the present." Thomas continued watching Keisha play with Buck, noting how she moved carefully through the world, as if afraid to disturb anything, how she cleaned up after herself and tried to make herself useful at every opportunity. This was a child who had learned to be grateful for small kindnesses, who understood that nothing in life was guaranteed. "There's one more thing to consider," Rosa said quietly. "Winter's just getting started. Even if you wanted to take her back to Denver, the passes will be snowed in for months. She's here until spring, whether we like it or not." The observation settled the matter in Thomas's mind. Whatever risks they faced by keeping Keisha, the immediate danger of trying to return her to Denver in winter weather was worse. They had time to figure out a more permanent solution, time to help her heal from the losses she'd endured, time to give her the childhood that had been stolen by circumstance and tragedy. "Then we keep her," Thomas said simply, "at least until spring, and we figure out the rest as we go." As if sensing their decision, Keisha looked up from where she was playing with Buck and waved at the three adults watching from the window. Her smile was hesitant but genuine, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict or control, but that the change might be exactly what both he and this brave child needed. The day after New Year brought unseasonably warm weather that melted the snow into muddy streams across the ranch. Thomas stood at his bedroom window, watching Keisha in the yard below as she helped Rosa hang laundry on the line strung between two pine trees. The girl worked with careful efficiency, handling the wet clothes as if they were precious items rather than everyday necessities. Something about her reverent treatment of simple domestic tasks spoke to years of scarcity, of learning not to take anything for granted. "She's got good hands," Miguel said from behind him. Thomas turned to find his ranch foreman in the doorway, hat in hand, concern written across his weathered features. Behind him stood Doc Harrison, the territory's only physician, who made monthly rounds to the outlying ranches. The elderly doctor's presence was unexpected. They hadn't sent for him. "Doc," Thomas said, stepping back from the window, "I wasn't expecting you today." "Miguel sent word," Doc Harrison said, setting down his medical bag. "Said you had a young guest who might need looking after." His keen eyes moved to the window where Keisha was now helping Rosa carry the empty laundry basket back toward the house. "That the child in question?" Thomas felt tension creep up his spine. "She seems healthy enough. No obvious signs of illness." "Maybe not," Doc Harrison said, "but a child who's walked over 100 miles through mountain winter needs a proper examination. Frostbite, malnutrition, exposure. These things don't always show themselves immediately." The doctor's practical concern was reasonable, but Thomas found himself reluctant to subject Keisha to scrutiny from another adult. She'd just begun to relax in his presence, to trust that this sanctuary might be permanent. The introduction of outsiders, even well-meaning ones, could shatter that fragile security. "She's been eating well, sleeping soundly," Thomas said carefully. "Rosa's been making sure she has proper clothes and warm baths." Doc Harrison moved to the window, studying Keisha with the clinical eye of someone accustomed to seeing suffering. "Uh-huh. And what's her story?" Miguel mentioned family troubles. Thomas had anticipated this question, but still found himself uncertain how much to reveal. "Her sister died recently. She was trying to avoid being placed in an institution in Denver." "What kind of institution?" The directness of the question forced Thomas to consider how much truth this situation could bear. "The kind that might not have her best interests at heart." Doc Harrison nodded grimly. "I've heard stories about some of those places, especially for children of mixed heritage." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "But that raises questions about what you're planning to do with her. You can't keep a child indefinitely without some kind of legal arrangement." "What kind of legal arrangement?" Thomas asked. "What options exist in the territory for situations like this?" "Adoption, though that would require proof of her parentage, and documentation that her biological family is deceased or unfit. Guardianship, which is less permanent but gives you legal authority to make decisions about her welfare." Doc Harrison sat down in the chair by Thomas's fireplace. "Or you could turn her over to the territorial authorities and let them handle placement." The last option made Thomas's stomach clench. "And what would happen then?" "Depends. If she's lucky, they'd find a decent family willing to take in a child of mixed blood. If she's unlucky," Doc Harrison shrugged. "Well, you said yourself she was trying to avoid certain institutions for good reason." Miguel shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "There's another consideration," he said reluctantly. "People in town are starting to ask questions." Thomas felt cold dread settle in his chest. "What kind of questions?" "About why Rosa's been buying extra supplies, why we've been ordering different kinds of provisions. Old Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned seeing a young girl in the wagon when Rosa went to town last week." Miguel paused. "And then?" And there's the question of a single man housing a girl child. Some folks might get the wrong idea about that arrangement. The implication was clear and ugly. Thomas felt anger rise in his throat, bitter and hot. The idea that people might assume the worst about his motivations, that they might see something improper in his decision to help a child in need, made him want to retreat further into isolation. "Let them think what they want," Thomas said sharply. "I know why she's here, and that's what matters." "It's not that simple," Doc Harrison said gently. "In a small community like Cedar Falls, reputation matters. And unfortunately, the reputation of a child of mixed blood matters even more. If people start talking, if they decide there's something inappropriate about this arrangement, it could destroy any chance she has of being accepted here." "Then what would you suggest?" Thomas asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Legitimize the situation," Doc Harrison said. "Find a way to make her presence here legally and socially acceptable, and do it quickly, before gossip becomes scandal." Rosa appeared in the doorway, having entered through the kitchen. "Keisha wants to know if she should start preparing lunch," she said. Then she noticed Doc Harrison and stopped. "Doctor, is someone ill?" "Just making sure our young guest is healthy," Doc Harrison replied kindly. "Would you mind asking her to come up? I'd like to examine her properly." Rosa hesitated, glancing at Thomas. "She's still pretty skittish around new people, especially men. Maybe it would be better if I stayed with her." "Of course," Doc Harrison agreed. "I'm not trying to frighten the child. Just want to make sure she's recovered from her journey." When Keisha appeared a few minutes later, her wariness was immediately apparent. She stood in the doorway, clutching Maya's journal, her eyes darting between the unfamiliar faces as if calculating escape routes. Thomas realized how overwhelming this must be for her. After days of quiet sanctuary, suddenly she was faced with strangers who might have the power to change her situation. "Keisha," Thomas said gently, "this is Doc Harrison. He takes care of people's health throughout the territory. He just wants to make sure you're feeling well after your long journey." "I'm fine," Keisha said quickly, though she didn't move closer. "To the doctor?" "I don't need doctoring." Doc Harrison smiled in what Thomas assumed was meant to be a reassuring manner. "I'm sure you are fine, but sometimes the effects of cold and hunger don't show up right away. I'd just like to listen to your breathing. Check that you don't have any signs of frostbite or other problems." Keisha looked to Thomas for guidance, and he found himself moved by her trust. "It's all right," he said. "Doc Harrison is a good man. He's helped lots of people in these parts." The examination was brief and gentle. Doc Harrison checked Keisha's hands and feet for signs of frostbite, listened to her breathing, and asked her a few questions about her health during the journey from Denver. Throughout the process, she answered in short, careful sentences, volunteering no more information than absolutely necessary. "She's remarkably healthy, considering," Doc Harrison concluded, packing up his medical bag. "Some malnutrition, but nothing that good food won't cure. Her feet show signs of hard walking, but no permanent damage." He paused. "She's also quite intelligent, articulate and observant beyond her years. Maya taught her well," Thomas said. "Her sister," Keisha clarified, speaking directly to Doc Harrison for the first time. "She made sure I knew how to read and write and figure numbers. Said education was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from you." Doc Harrison nodded approvingly. "Your sister was wise, but formal education would be beneficial too. There's talk of establishing a proper school in Cedar Falls within the next year or two." Thomas saw Keisha's eyes light up with interest, and he realized that despite everything she'd endured, she was still a child who craved learning and normalcy. The idea of school, of being around other children and engaging with books and lessons, clearly appealed to her. "Would I be allowed?" Keisha asked quietly. "At the school, I mean, with other children?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications about race and social acceptance that no child should have to consider. Doc Harrison glanced at Thomas before answering. "That would depend on several factors," he said gently. But in general, education is beneficial for all children, regardless of their background. As Doc Harrison prepared to leave, he spoke quietly to Thomas in the hallway. That child has been through more than most adults could handle, but she's got strength and intelligence that will serve her well if she's given proper opportunities. The question is whether this community is ready to accept her as she is. And if they're not, then you'll have to decide how far you're willing to go to protect her, because once word spreads about her presence here, there won't be any going back to anonymity. 2 weeks into January, Thomas found Keisha sitting on the kitchen floor at dawn, surrounded by pages from Maya's journal. She had the leather-bound book open in her lap, and tears were streaming silently down her face as she read by lamplight. Buck lay beside her, his head resting across her legs in wordless comfort. "Couldn't sleep?" Thomas asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Keisha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but didn't try to hide her grief. "I read Maya's words when I miss her too much," she said. "She wrote down things she wanted to remember about people we met, places we stayed, dreams she had for when we got settled again." Thomas poured himself coffee from the pot that always stayed warm on the stove and sat down on the floor beside her, ignoring the protest from his joints. "What kinds of dreams?" Keisha turned a page carefully, as if the journal might crumble at rough handling. She wanted to open a school someday, teach children who didn't have other chances to learn. She wrote down the names of books she wanted to collect, ideas for lessons she could teach. Her voice caught slightly. She even drew pictures of what the schoolhouse might look like, figured out exactly how much money we'd need to buy land and supplies. Thomas looked at the neat handwriting that filled the pages, the careful sketches and calculations of a teenager trying to build a future from nothing. "She sounds incredibly determined." "Maya never gave up on anything," Keisha agreed. "Even when things got really bad, she'd say, we just needed to get through today, and tomorrow would bring new possibilities." She turned another page and smiled through her tears. "Look at this." Thomas leaned closer to read the entry Keisha was pointing to. It was dated about 6 months ago, and the handwriting was more hurried than usual, as if written in excitement. "Keisha learned to read from the Bible today without any help from me. She's so smart, maybe even smarter than I am. When we get settled, she could be anything she wants. Teacher, store owner, maybe even a doctor if she sets her mind to it. I need to make sure she has that chance. I need to make sure I don't mess this up for her." "She wrote about you all the time," Keisha said, turning more pages. "Look, here's from when you first started helping with the washing. And here's when you read that whole book about plants and animals in one afternoon. She was so proud of how smart you were." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he read the entries documenting ordinary childhood moments made extraordinary by circumstance. Maya had recorded Keisha's first successful attempt at bartering for supplies, her excitement over finding a library that allowed her to browse books, her careful saving of the nickel she'd earned helping an elderly woman with. Her marketing, each entry was filled with love and hope, a young woman's determination to preserve her little sister's childhood despite impossible circumstances. "She believed in you," Thomas said quietly. "She believed in both of us, said we were a team, that as long as we stuck together we could handle anything." Keisha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But then she got sick, and I couldn't save her. I couldn't even afford to save her." The guilt in those words was adult-sized, far too heavy for an 11-year-old to carry. Thomas remembered his own struggles with survivor's guilt, the endless questions about what he could have done differently to prevent the cholera that took Sarah and Emma, but at least his guilt was rooted in a disease that struck randomly. Keisha was blaming herself for lacking resources that no child should have been expected to provide. "Keisha," he said firmly, "your sister's death wasn't your fault. Consumption takes people regardless of their wealth or station. Even people with the best doctors and medicine sometimes can't fight it." She looked up at him with eyes too old for her face. "Maya used to say the same thing when I worried about money or food, or whether we'd have somewhere to sleep. She'd tell me it wasn't my job to fix everything, but if it wasn't my job, whose was it? Who was supposed to take care of us if we didn't take care of ourselves? The questions struck at the heart of everything Thomas had been wrestling with since Keisha's arrival. Who indeed was responsible for children who fell through the cracks of a system that barely existed on the frontier? How many kids like Keisha and Maya were out there right now, trying to navigate adult problems with childhood resources? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Thomas could see 3 riders coming. Up the main trail, Sheriff Morrison, his deputy Jake Collins, and a third man Thomas didn't recognize. His blood ran cold as he realized this was the moment he'd been dreading since Keisha's arrival. "Keisha," he said quietly, "I need you to go upstairs to my study and wait there. Don't come down until I come get you, understand?" The urgency in his voice must have communicated the seriousness of the situation, because Keisha didn't ask questions. She simply gathered Maya's journal and slipped up the back stairs, moving with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to make herself invisible when adults were discussing her future. Thomas opened the front door before the men could knock, stepping onto the porch to meet them rather than inviting them inside. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man, but bound by territorial law. His deputy was younger, less experienced, and prone to making assumptions based on prejudice rather than evidence. The third man was the wild card, well-dressed, official-looking, probably from Denver. "Morning, Thomas," Sheriff Morrison said, though his usual friendliness was noticeably absent. "This here's Marshal Crawford from the territorial capital. He's looking for a missing child." Thomas felt his chest tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "Missing child?" Marshal Crawford stepped forward, pulling a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Girl named Keisha Williams, age 11, disappeared from Denver about 6 weeks ago. Mixed Negro and Mexican heritage. Last seen heading toward the mountain settlements." He studied Thomas's face carefully. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone matching that description?" "Can't say that I have," Thomas replied. "But then, I don't see many travelers up here during winter. The passes are usually too dangerous." "That's what makes this case so unusual," Crawford continued. "Most folks would have the sense not to attempt mountain travel in December, but this child apparently walked over 100 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory." Deputy Collins spoke up for the first time. "Word around Cedar Falls is you've had some kind of guest staying here recently. Rosa Hernandez has been buying extra supplies, different kinds of provisions than usual." Thomas felt anger flash through him at the deputy's suspicious tone. "Rosa manages my household as she sees fit. If she's been buying extra supplies, it's probably because we're expecting a hard winter." "Mind if we take a look around?" Crawford asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a request. "Actually, I do mind," Thomas said evenly. "Unless you have some kind of legal authority to search my property." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Thomas, no need to make this difficult. We're just trying to locate a missing child who might be in danger, and I'm trying to protect my rights as a landowner," Thomas replied. "If you have evidence that I'm harboring a fugitive, produce it. If you have a warrant, show it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd conduct your investigation elsewhere." The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut. Thomas could see the wheels turning in Crawford's head, weighing the political implications of forcing a confrontation with one of the territory's more prominent citizens against the importance of finding the missing child. "The thing is, Mr. Bennett," Crawford said slowly, "this isn't just about a runaway child anymore. There are other factors at play. Questions about how she ended up missing in the first place, concerns about the institution she was fleeing from." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. "What kind of concerns?" "Let's just say that if we find her, she won't be returned to the same placement that caused her to run originally." Crawford paused. "But she does need to be found." A child of her age and background can't survive indefinitely on her own, especially not in this territory during winter. The implication was clear. They suspected Thomas was harboring Keisha, but they were also acknowledging that her original situation had been problematic. It was an opening, perhaps, for negotiation rather than confrontation. If such a child were to be found, Thomas said carefully, what would happen to her? That would depend on several factors. Whether she had any family willing to take her, in whether there were suitable guardians available, whether the territorial authorities deemed her current situation safe and appropriate. Crawford studied Thomas's face. Why do you ask? Before Thomas could respond, they all heard the sound of another horse approaching at speed. Miguel rode up the trail, his face grim with news that Thomas suspected would complicate an already dangerous situation. Miguel dismounted his horse quickly, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious urgency. "Thomas," he said, nodding briefly. To the three lawmen, "I need to speak with you privately. It's about the situation we discussed." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Whatever it is, Miguel, might be relevant to our investigation. We're looking for a missing child from Denver." Miguel glanced between Thomas and the officials, clearly weighing his loyalties. "With respect, Sheriff, this is ranch business. Nothing to do with missing children." But Marshal Crawford wasn't buying the deflection. "Mr. Hernandez, isn't it? You've worked for Mr. Bennett for several years. You'd have noticed if there were any unusual activity on this ranch, wouldn't you?" The direct question put Miguel in an impossible position. Thomas could see his foreman struggling with the choice between truth and loyalty, between protecting Keisha and avoiding a direct lie to territorial authorities. "Miguel," Thomas said firmly, "whatever news you have, it can wait until our guests have finished their business here." But Deputy Collins had noticed something that made Thomas's blood run cold. "That's smoke coming from the main house," he said, pointing toward the kitchen chimney. "Awful lot of cooking going on for a man who lives alone." "Rosa prepares meals for the ranch hands," Thomas explained, though he could hear the strain in his own voice. "In the main house," Collins pressed. "Thought the hands ate in the bunkhouse." Before Thomas could respond, the front door opened and Rosa stepped onto the porch, her face carefully composed, but her eyes reflecting the same tension everyone else felt. In her hands, she carried a tray with coffee and biscuits, a gesture of hospitality that was also clearly a message. "Gentlemen," she said with polite firmness, "if you're going to be conducting business on Mr. Bennett's porch, you might as well do it with proper refreshment." Marshal Crawford accepted a cup of coffee, studying Rosa with the same careful attention he'd been giving Thomas. "Mrs. Hernandez, I understand you manage the household here. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Any changes in routine, extra provisions, unexpected guests?" Rosa met his gaze steadily. "I manage Mr. Bennett's home according to his needs and instructions. If he says there's nothing unusual, then there's nothing unusual." The loyalty in her response was unmistakable, but Thomas could see that Crawford was far from satisfied. The marshal was clearly an experienced investigator, someone who knew how to read between the lines of what people weren't saying. Miguel cleared his throat. "Thomas, that matter I mentioned, it's becoming urgent. Maybe these gentlemen would be interested to know that riders came through Cedar Falls this morning, asking about the same missing child." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What kind of riders?" "3 men, well-armed, claiming to be bounty hunters hired by the child's family in Denver." Miguel's voice carried a warning that made everyone on the porch tense, but folks in town didn't believe that story. Something about them didn't sit right. Marshal Crawford set down his coffee cup with sharp attention. "What kind of something?" "The way they talked about the child," Miguel said carefully. "Like she was property to be recovered rather than a person to be helped. And they were asking the wrong questions, more interested in whether anyone had seen money or valuables than whether the child was safe." Sheriff Morrison frowned. "That doesn't sound like legitimate family representatives." "No, it doesn't," Crawford agreed grimly. It sounds like people with other motives for finding her. He looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Bennett, if you are harboring this child, she may be in more danger than any of us realized. The revelation changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Thomas found himself caught between multiple dangers, protecting Keisha from the authorities who might return her to an unsafe situation, and protecting her from whatever threat these mysterious riders represented. "Or what aren't you telling us?" Thomas asked Crawford directly. "What's really going on with this case?" Crawford exchanged glances with Sheriff Morrison before answering. "The institution she ran from in Denver, let's just say there have been questions about their operations, questions about where some of the children placed there actually end up." The implication made Thomas's blood run cold. "You're talking about human trafficking. I'm talking about a situation where a child of mixed heritage might be seen as valuable commodity by the wrong people," Crawford said bluntly. "And if those riders Miguel mentioned are connected to that trade, then hiding her isn't enough anymore. She needs official protection." Thomas felt the walls closing in around them. Every option seemed to lead to danger for Keisha, turning her over to authorities who might not be able to protect her, keeping her hidden from people who were clearly determined to find her, or trying to move her to safety through terrain that was still dangerous in winter weather. "There's something else," Miguel said reluctantly. "Old Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned to the riders that Rosa's been buying supplies for a young girl. Described her as helpful and well-mannered, said she'd been learning to read from Rosa's Bible." Thomas closed his eyes, realizing that their attempt to maintain secrecy had failed. Too many people in a small community had noticed the changes in their routine, the evidence of a child's presence at the ranch, and now that information was in the hands of people who might wish Keisha harm. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked. "The riders were heading up the mountain trail when I left town," Miguel said. "Maybe an hour, hour and a half behind me." Crawford stood up abruptly. "Mr. Bennett, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's happening here. You've got that child, and you've been protecting her from a situation that was clearly dangerous. But now we're all in over our heads. What do you suggest?" "Let us take her into official custody. We can protect her properly, make sure she's placed somewhere safe while we sort out the legal complications." Crawford paused. "Or we can all wait here for those riders to arrive and see what they have in mind." Thomas felt his protective instincts surge. The idea of turning Keisha over to strangers, even well-meaning ones, after she'd specifically sought his protection, felt like a betrayal. But the alternative might be worse. "I need to talk to her," Thomas said. "She deserves to understand the situation and have a say in what happens next." "There isn't time," Deputy Collins said, pointing down the trail where dust clouds indicated approaching horses. "Those riders are almost here." Thomas looked at the faces surrounding him, Miguel's loyalty warring with fear, Rosa's protective determination, Crawford's professional concern, and Morrison's obvious discomfort with the whole situation. They were all trying to do what was right, but their different perspectives on what that meant had created an impossible dilemma. "Sheriff," Thomas said finally, "I want your word that whatever happens here, that child's safety comes first. Not the law, not protocol, not politics. Her safety." Morrison nodded grimly. "You have it," as the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Thomas realized they were about to face the first real test of that promise. The mysterious riders were almost at the ranch, and everyone present was about to discover what they truly wanted with an 11-year-old girl who had walked over 100 miles to escape them. Before anyone could react to the approaching riders, Keisha appeared on the porch, clutching Maya's journal, her face pale and her hands shaking. She had clearly been listening from inside the house and had heard enough of the conversation to understand the gravity of their situation. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found something in Maya's journal, something she hid from me." Thomas moved quickly to her side, noting how she clutched the leather-bound book as if it were a lifeline. "Keisha, this isn't the time. It is the time," she interrupted, her young voice carrying an authority that made all the adults pause. "Because what Maya hid might be the reason those men are coming for me." Marshal Crawford stepped closer, his professional instincts overriding protocol. "What kind of something?" With trembling hands, Keisha opened the journal to a section Thomas had never seen before, pages that had been tucked behind a loose back binding. The paper was different from the rest, older, more fragile, and covered with Maya's careful handwriting, alongside what appeared to be official documents that had been copied by hand. "Maya lied to me about our family," Keisha said, her voice breaking. "About who we really are." Thomas took the journal from her shaking hands and read the first entry aloud. "Keisha's father isn't dead like I told her. His name is Samuel Rodriguez, and he was a cavalry scout for the army before he disappeared. Mama made me promise never to tell Keisha the truth because she was afraid of what it would mean for both of us." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Thomas continued reading as the lawman gathered closer. Mama's real name wasn't Rebecca Williams. It was Elena Martinez, and she was married to a wealthy Mexican rancher named Carlos Martinez before she met Samuel. She fled from Carlos because he was violent, but she never got a proper divorce. When she got pregnant with Keisha, she took Samuel's name and created false papers to hide from Carlos's family. Thomas looked up at Keisha, who was watching his face with growing alarm. "Did you know any of this?" "Nothing," Keisha said, tears streaming down her face. "Maya always said our father died in an Apache attack before I was born, and I never questioned anything about Mama's name or our papers." She paused, her voice getting smaller. "What does this mean? Am I even legally who I think I am?" Crawford had been listening with growing tension. "Miss, may I see those documents?" Keisha nodded, and Thomas handed over the journal. Crawford studied the copied papers with the expert eye of someone familiar with legal documentation. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read. "These are copies of a marriage certificate between Elena Martinez and Carlos Martinez, dated 1862, he said slowly. "And here's a birth certificate for Elena that shows she was born in Santa Fe to a prominent merchant family." He looked up at Keisha. "If these documents are accurate, you're not just a mixed-race orphan from Denver. You're the daughter of Elena Martinez, whose family owned substantial mining interests in New Mexico territory." Sheriff Morrison whistled low. "The Martinez mining fortune? That family's been feuding over inheritance rights for years." Thomas felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "That's why those riders are after her. It's not about human trafficking, it's about money." "What money?" Keisha asked, clearly overwhelmed by revelations that were reshaping everything. She understood about her identity. Crawford consulted the journal again. "According to these notes, your mother Elena was the sole heir to her father's mining claims when she fled her abusive first marriage. Those claims have been producing silver for over 15 years, and the accumulated wealth would be substantial." He paused. "If you can prove your identity and your mother's legal right to inherit, you could be entitled to a significant fortune." The dust clouds were getting closer, and Miguel pointed down the trail. "Those riders will be here in minutes. If they're working for Carlos Martinez or his family, they're not planning to file legal papers." Thomas felt his protective instincts surge. "You think they mean to harm her?" "I think they mean to eliminate any threat to their control of the Martinez fortune," Crawford said grimly. "A 12-year-old girl with legitimate inheritance claims would be extremely inconvenient for people who have been managing that wealth for over a decade." Rosa, who had been silent during these revelations, suddenly spoke up. "There's more in that journal. I can see other pages tucked in there." Keisha reached for the journal with shaking hands and pulled out additional documents. "Maya wrote something else," she said, "about why she never tried to contact our mother's family." Thomas read over her shoulder. "Elena's brothers, Diego and Fernando Martinez, have been searching for her since she disappeared. Not because they love her, but because they need proof of her death to claim her inheritance legally. They hired men to track her down in 1869, and those men found her in Denver. She had to run again, pregnant with Keisha, and Samuel helped her create the false identity as Rebecca Williams. What terrifies me is that Diego and Fernando never stopped looking. They have money and connections, and they're getting older. They need to resolve Elena's legal status soon, or the territorial courts might award her inheritance to distant relatives instead of them. This explains everything, Crawford said. The pieces falling into place. Those riders aren't bounty hunters looking for a runaway child. They're assassins hired to eliminate the last obstacle to a mining fortune. The sound of approaching horses was now clearly audible, and Thomas could see 3 riders cresting the hill about half a mile away. They rode with the purposeful confidence of men who expected no resistance. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, looking around at the faces surrounding him. Sheriff Morrison was already checking his sidearm. "We protect the child, just like you asked." But Keisha stepped forward, her young face set with determination that reminded Thomas painfully of Emma's stubborn courage. "No," she said firmly. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid of people who want to hurt me for things I can't control." "Keisha," Thomas began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Maya spent her whole life protecting me from the truth, and it killed her. She worked herself to death trying to keep us hidden from people who were always going to find us eventually." Keisha looked directly at the approaching riders. "If I'm really Elena Martinez's daughter, if I really have legal claim to mining rights, then maybe it's time to stop being a victim and start fighting back." Crawford studied the young girl with new respect. "That's a brave sentiment, but you're talking about taking on powerful men with significant resources, the kind of men who hire killers to solve their problems. Then I guess it's lucky I found people willing to stand up to killers," Keisha said, looking around at Thomas, Miguel, Rosa, and the 2 lawmen. "Maya always said family wasn't about blood. It was about people who choose to protect each other when things get dangerous." Thomas felt something shift in his chest as he realized what she was asking. Not for rescue, but for partnership. Not for protection, but for the chance to fight for her own future with people who believed in her right to have one. The riders were close enough now that individual faces were visible. Hard men with the look of professional gunfighters. The kind who would kill a child without hesitation if the price was right. "All right," Thomas said, moving to stand beside Keisha. "But we do this smart, and we do this together." Crawford nodded approvingly. "First thing we need to do is get those documents to safety. If something happens to us, someone needs to know the truth about who this child really is." As the 3 gunmen rode into the yard of the Circleby Ranch, Thomas realized they were about to face the most dangerous confrontation of their lives. But for the first time since Keisha had arrived in his world, he felt like they were fighting for something bigger than just survival. They were fighting for justice, for truth, and for a child's right to claim the identity that had been stolen from her before she was even born. The 3 riders pulled their horses to a stop about 30 yards from the porch, close enough to make their intentions clear, but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. Thomas studied them with the eye of a man who had spent years in mining camps where violence was always a possibility. The leader was a tall, lean man, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of pale eyes that suggested a complete absence of conscience. His companions were younger, but carried themselves with the professional ease of men accustomed to killing for money. "Afternoon," the leader called out, his voice carrying a slight Mexican accent despite his obvious attempt to suppress it. "Beautiful ranch you have here, Mr. Bennett. We're looking for someone who might have passed this way." Thomas stepped forward, acutely aware of Keisha behind him and the way she'd gone completely still. "And who might that be?" "Young girl. Mixed blood. Probably calling herself Keisha Williams." The man's pale eyes scanned the group on the porch, taking in every detail. "Understand, she might be traveling with stolen property." Marshal Crawford moved slightly to his left. creating a better angle of fire while appearing casual. What kind of stolen property? Family documents, legal papers that don't belong to her. The leader dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. Her late mother took some things when she ran off years ago, things that belonged to the Martinez family. Thomas felt Keisha tense at the mention of her mother, and he moved to shield her more completely. Seems like family business should be handled by family, not hired guns. The man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Diego Martinez sends his regards. He's been looking for his sister Elena's daughter for a long time. Wants to make sure she's properly cared for. How thoughtful of him, Rosa said acidly, her maternal instincts clearly outraged by the obvious lie. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat officially. I'm Sheriff Morrison, and this is Marshal Crawford from the territorial capital. If there's family business to be resolved, it can be done through proper legal channels. The second rider, a shorter man with a scar across his left cheek, laughed harshly. Legal channels. Sheriff, the Martinez family has been trying to resolve this through legal channels for 15 years. Sometimes you have to take a more direct approach. Crawford's hand rested casually on his gun butt. What kind of direct approach? The kind that ensures certain problems don't continue to cause difficulties for legitimate business interests, the leader said, his veneer of politeness beginning to slip. The child has something that belongs to the Martinez family. We're here to retrieve it. Thomas felt his anger building. The child has a name, and she's under my protection. Your protection? The leader looked around at the small group on the porch with obvious amusement. Mr. Bennett, you're a businessman. Surely you understand that some situations require practical solutions rather than sentimental ones. Behind Thomas, Keisha stepped forward, her young voice clear and strong. My name is Keisha Rodriguez Martinez, and I'm not afraid of you. The effect of her words on the three gunmen was immediate and telling. The leader's casual confidence cracked, replaced by sharp attention. His companions exchanged glances that confirmed what Thomas had suspected. They knew exactly who she was and what her existence meant to their employers. Rodriguez, the scarred man repeated. So you do know the truth about your parentage. I know my mother was Elena Martinez, daughter of Antonio Martinez, and that she fled from her abusive first husband with my father, Samuel Rodriguez, Keisha said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I know she had legal claim to mining and properties that have been producing wealth for 15 years, and I know that her brothers have been trying to have her declared dead so they can steal her inheritance. The leader's hand moved closer to his weapon. Child, you're playing with forces beyond your understanding. The Martinez family has resources you can't imagine. They have lawyers, judges, territorial officials in their employ. Even if everything you say is true, you'll never live to prove it in court. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself directly between the gunman and Keisha. She doesn't have to prove anything. She has witnesses, legal documentation, and the protection of territorial law enforcement. Law enforcement? The leader looked at Crawford and Morrison with contempt. Marshal, surely you understand the realities of territorial politics. The Martinez family contributes significantly to territorial development funds. They have friends in high places. Crawford's expression hardened. They may have friends, but they don't have me. And any attempt to harm this child will be met with the full force of territorial justice. The tension on the ranch was thick enough to cut. Thomas could see Miguel positioning himself near the corner of the porch, where he'd have a clear shot at the mounted riders. Rosa had quietly moved closer to Keisha, ready to shield her if shooting started. The two lawmen were spread out to create crossfire if needed, but the leader wasn't finished. Mr. Bennett, I have a proposition for you. A business proposition. I'm listening, Thomas said, though every instinct told him to end this conversation before it went further. The Martinez family is prepared to compensate you handsomely for your inconvenience. $20,000 for you to forget you ever saw this child. She disappears, the legal complications disappear, everyone goes back to their normal lives. The offer hung in the air like poison. Thomas could feel everyone's eyes on him, waiting to see if he could be bought. $20,000 was more money than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. And what happens to her? Thomas asked quietly. That's not your concern, the leader replied. The Martinez family will handle their internal affairs. As they see fit. Thomas looked back at Keisha, seeing the fear in her eyes despite her brave words. This child had walked over 100 miles through dangerous terrain to find safety, had trusted him with secrets that could get her killed, had shown more courage in her young life than most adults would ever need. The idea of selling her to men who clearly intended her harm for any amount of money was obscene. Counteroffer, Thomas said, his voice carrying the cold authority he'd once used in mining camp negotiations. You and your men ride away from my ranch right now, and I won't. Ask Marshal Crawford to arrest you for conspiracy to commit murder. The leader's face darkened. Mr. Bennett, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. I understand it perfectly. 3 hired killers have come to my ranch to murder a 12-year-old girl for the crime of existing. They're threatening law enforcement officers and attempting to bribe a witness to turn over a child to people who mean her harm. Thomas took another step forward. What I don't understand is why you're still here, the scarred man spoke up. Because we have our orders, and we don't leave a job unfinished. Sheriff Morrison drew his gun with practiced ease. Then I guess you'll be finishing it in territorial custody. You're all under arrest for conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and threatening a minor. But instead of surrendering, the 3 gunmen spread out, their intentions clear. The leader kept his eyes fixed on Thomas while speaking to his companions. Remember, we need the documents intact. The girl is expendable, but those papers must be recovered. Thomas felt Keisha press closer to his back, and he could hear her whispered prayer in Spanish. Something Maya must have taught her for moments. Of extreme danger. The sound of her fear cut through his own terror and crystallized his resolve. Miguel, he called out, never taking his eyes off the leader. Rosa, get Keisha inside the house. No, Keisha said firmly. I'm tired of hiding. If they want to kill me for being Elena Martinez's daughter, then I'll die standing up for who I am. Her courage in the face of mortal danger was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Thomas realized that this moment would define not just whether they survived, but who they were as people. Keisha had chosen to stand and fight for her identity, her rights, and her future. The least he could do was stand with her. Marshal, Thomas said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. I want it on record that these men came to my ranch with the specific intent to murder a child for financial gain. Noted, Crawford replied, his own weapon, now drawn. And I want it on record that they were given every opportunity to withdraw peacefully. The leader's smile was cold and final. Mr. Bennett, you're about to learn that some business disputes can't be resolved through negotiation. As the 3 gunmen began to draw their weapons, Thomas realized they were about to face a gunfight that would determine not just Keisha's fate, but the future of everyone who had chosen to stand with her against the kind of evil that saw children as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be protected. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, and Thomas found himself thinking of Sarah and Emma, hoping they would be proud of the choice he was making. Some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, and the right of a child to live free from those who would harm her was at the top of that list. The first shot came from the scarred man, aimed at Sheriff Morrison, but going wide as the lawman dove behind the porch railing. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the afternoon quiet, sending Thomas's cattle lowing in alarm from the distant pasture. Thomas grabbed Keisha and pulled her down behind the stone steps as bullets splintered the wooden posts around them. Marshal. Crawford returned fire with deadly precision, his first shot catching the youngest gunman in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The wounded man hit the ground hard, but rolled behind his spooked horse, using the animal for cover as he tried to stem the bleeding from his arm. "Stay down!" Thomas shouted to Keisha, but she had already pressed herself flat against the stone. Foundation. Maya's journal clutched protectively against her chest. Her face was pale but determined, and Thomas realized she was counting shots, trying to track how much ammunition each side had remaining. Miguel had taken position at the corner of the porch with his rifle, and his first shot sent the leader's horse rearing in panic. The animal's wild dancing spoiled the gunman's aim, causing his return fire to go high and punch holes in the ranch house's wooden siding instead of finding human targets. "Rosa!" Thomas called, not daring to turn around to look for her. "Get to the kitchen! Stay away from the windows!" But Rosa had other plans. From somewhere inside the house came the distinctive sound of Thomas's hunting rifle being cocked, followed by the crash of a window being broken out. A moment later, the housekeeper's voice rang out clear and strong. "You men picked the wrong ranch to bring trouble to." Her shot took the leader's hat clean off his head and sent him diving for cover, behind the stone well in the center of the yard. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. The gunmen found themselves caught in crossfire between the porch and the house, with limited cover and wounded comrade. Sheriff Morrison had regained his position and was firing methodically at the scarred man, who was trying to work his way around to flank their position. Each of the sheriff's shots forced the gunman to duck lower behind his horse, limiting his ability to return effective fire. "They're trying to get behind us!" Crawford shouted over the gunfire. "Miguel, watch the left side!" But Miguel was already moving, his ranch-hardened reflexes serving him well in this deadly situation. He shifted position to cover the approach. The scarred man was attempting, forcing the gunman to abandon his flanking maneuver or risk being caught in the open. The leader, now pinned behind the well, called out to his men, "Circle around! We need those documents!" Thomas realized with cold clarity that the gunmen weren't just trying to kill them. They were still hoping to complete their mission by recovering Maya's journal and the evidence it contained. The knowledge gave him an idea, but it would require exposing himself to enemy fire. "Keisha," he said urgently, "I need you to get that journal to Rosa. Can you make it to the kitchen door?" She looked at the distance between their position and the back of the house, about 20 feet of open ground. That would leave her completely vulnerable for several seconds. "What about you? I'll draw their fire. Keep them busy while you move." Before she could protest, Thomas rose from cover and began advancing on the well, his revolver blazing. The bold move caught the gunmen by surprise. Instead of the defensive tactics they expected, he was attacking directly. His aggressive advance forced all three men to concentrate their fire on him, exactly as he'd hoped. Behind him, Keisha sprinted for the kitchen door, her small form low and fast as she covered the open ground. Thomas saw her reach safety just as a bullet grazed his left arm, sending fire through his shoulder and nearly spinning him around. The wound wasn't serious, but it slowed him enough for the leader to get a clear shot. The bullet caught Thomas in the side, low and to the left, sending him staggering backward toward the porch. He could feel warm blood spreading through his shirt, and his vision wavered for a moment. "Thomas!" Keisha's voice cut through the gunfire. From the kitchen window, Miguel's answering roar of rage was followed by a barrage of rifle fire that drove the leader back behind the well. The wounded youngest gunman tried to use the distraction to advance, but Crawford's steady aim put him down permanently with a shot to the chest. 2 against 5 now. But Thomas could feel his strength ebbing from blood loss. He managed to reach the cover of the porch, but his left side was beginning to go numb, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. "How bad?" Sheriff Morrison asked, appearing beside him during a lull in the firing. "Bad enough," Thomas admitted, pressing his hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. "But not as bad as it's going to be for them." From the kitchen window, Rosa's rifle spoke again, this time catching the scarred man as he tried to reload behind his horse. The impact sent him sprawling, but he managed to crawl behind a water trough, still alive but clearly hurt. That left only the leader, now alone behind the well, but still dangerous. Thomas could hear him reloading, preparing for what would probably be a final desperate assault. The man had lost his companions and his tactical advantage, but he still had the desperate fury of someone with nothing left to lose. "He's going to make a run for it," Crawford observed, checking his own ammunition. "Probably try to get close enough to finish us before we can stop him." Thomas looked toward the kitchen where Keisha waited with Rosa, then at Miguel and the two lawmen who had risked their lives to protect a child they barely knew. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether justice prevailed or whether evil won through simple brutality. The leader's voice rang out across the yard, filled with rage and desperation. "This isn't over. The Martinez family has more men, more money, more influence than you can imagine. That child will never be safe." Thomas found his voice, despite the pain radiating through his side. "Maybe not," he called back, "but she'll be free, and sometimes that's enough." The leader's final charge came with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He broke from cover behind the well, both guns blazing as he sprinted toward the porch in a desperate attempt to reach his targets before their superior numbers could overwhelm him. His first shots splintered the wooden railings inches from where Thomas lay wounded, but the gunman's wild run made his aim erratic. Marshal Crawford rose to meet the assault, his revolver tracking the charging figure with professional calm. His first shot caught the leader in the leg, sending him stumbling but not stopping his advance. The wounded gunman fired again, this time coming closer to his mark as Sheriff Morrison dove for cover. Miguel's rifle boomed from the corner of the porch, but the leader's erratic movement spoiled his aim, and the bullet whined off the stone well behind the gunman. The scarred man behind the water trough tried to provide covering fire for his leader's charge, but Rosa's shooting from the kitchen kept him pinned down. Thomas struggled to rise, knowing that the leader's desperate gambit might succeed if everyone remained focused on defensive positions. Through his pain and blurred vision, he could see that the gunman would reach the porch within seconds, close enough to use his remaining ammunition with deadly effect. But as the leader cleared the last few yards, a small figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. Keisha stepped into view, holding Thomas's double-barreled shotgun, the weapon almost too large for her to manage properly. The leader saw her at the same moment and swung his guns toward this new threat, recognizing that she was his primary target. "No!" Thomas roared, finding strength he didn't know he possessed. He lunged upward from his position, throwing himself between Keisha and the charging gunman, just as both triggers were pulled. The shotgun's blast was deafening in the confined space of the porch. The wide pattern of buckshot caught the leader, center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing backward into the dirt of the ranch yard. He hit the ground hard and lay still, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the Colorado sky. But the leader's final shots had found their mark. Thomas felt the impact like a sledgehammer blow, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down. The porch steps. He could hear Keisha screaming his name, could sense people running toward him, but everything seemed to be happening at a great distance. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the confusion. "Miguel, check on that last one behind the trough." The scarred gunman had been hit by Rosa's rifle and was no longer a threat, but Morrison's caution proved wise. The man was still breathing, though barely, and his hand was reaching weakly for a dropped pistol. Miguel kicked the weapon away and quickly bound the wounded man's hands with rope. "He'll live long enough to stand trial," Miguel reported grimly. "Maybe long enough to tell us who else was involved in this conspiracy." Thomas tried to focus on the faces gathering around him, but his vision kept sliding in and out of clarity. He could see Keisha kneeling beside him, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against his wounds in an attempt to stop the bleeding. "Don't you die on me," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare die on me, Thomas Bennett. You promised to keep me safe, and I'm promising to keep you safe too." Her young voice carried the same determined strength she'd shown throughout their ordeal, and Thomas found himself smiling despite the pain. This brave child, who had endured so much loss, was now fighting to prevent another death, another abandonment. Marshal Crawford knelt beside them, his professional demeanor softened by obvious concern. "How bad is it?" Rosa appeared with clean towels and her medical supplies, her face grim but determined. "Bad but not hopeless. The bullets went through clean, missed the vital organs. He's lost blood, but he's tough." Thomas tried to speak, but found his voice weak and unsteady. "The journal. Did it survive?" Keisha held up Maya's leather-bound book, miraculously unharmed, despite the violence that had swirled around it. "Every page intact. All the evidence. We need to prove who I am and what the Martinez family was trying to do." Sheriff Morrison was examining the bodies of the fallen gunmen, checking their pockets for identification and evidence. "Professional killers, just like we suspected. And look at this." He held up a leather folder containing official-looking documents. Orders from Diego Martinez himself, authorizing the recovery of family property and the elimination of obstacles to that recovery. Crawford whistled low. "That's enough to bring charges against the entire Martinez conspiracy. This child won't have to worry about them anymore." As Thomas felt his strength slowly returning under Rosa's careful ministrations, he realized that the immediate danger was over. The gunmen were dead or captured, the evidence was secure, and Keisha was safe. But more than that, she had shown the kind of courage that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead.